Most people believe the hardest part of change is deciding to make it, but what actually keeps them stuck is what happens after the decision. Welcome to Breakthrough Weekly. I'm your host, Monica Pelayo. This is where we examine the subconscious patterns shaping your decisions so you could change them. If you're new here, welcome. And if you're returning, thank you for being back. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss future Breakthrough Weekly episodes. Today's episode is titled The Hardest Part of Change Isn't Deciding, It's What Comes After. Let's begin. Most people think the hardest part is deciding to change. It's not. The hardest part is what comes after. It's the phase where you're no longer who you were, but not yet fully grounded in who you're becoming. You know that in between space that feels uncertain, inconsistent, and at times deeply discouraging. And this is where most people stop, not because they can't change, but because they don't understand what's actually happening. After 22 years as an executive assistant at a large Fortune 100 company, I was laid off at the end of November of 2024. A week or two later, I registered my business in December with a February launch date already in mind. But the months leading up to that moment had been relentless. I had been grieving my dad's passing, navigating an eviction notice that arrived the day I returned from his funeral, and preparing for a move from Santa Clara, California, back to Oregon. By the time the layoff came, everything had already stacked. I needed time to decompress and reset. But I wasn't idle. While I was finding my footing, I was also working with my website developer and designer, someone who became a close friend and kept me accountable through the whole process. We were building my logo, setting up my platforms, creating the foundation. I reminded myself on the hard days that this work was more important than anything else because it was going to allow me to survive in the future. By February, the foundation was built. I was ready. Then the lawsuit arrived. It was personal. It's someone I trusted who worked in a medical office told me that even a personal lawsuit could impact my liability insurance and potentially get it canceled. That wasn't a fear I invented. It was information from someone in a professional setting, and I took it seriously. The thought of calling my insurance company and hearing that my coverage could be canceled was so loud that it drowned out the equally real possibility that the answer would be fine. The fear just felt justified. That's exactly what made it so effective at keeping me stuck. The lawsuit had also come with betrayal. People I had been close to and what that came distrust and fear of visibility. I worried about what it could mean for my image and the brand I was building. I pulled back for a month and a half. When I finally called, they told me it wouldn't impact my business at all. Nothing external had been stopping me. Our fears rob us of our own goals, opportunities, and desires. They don't create real barriers. They make imagined ones feel real, and the mind responds as if they are. And when those fears are backed by information that seems credible, they become even harder to question. And even after I got that clarity, the resistance didn't disappear. It just changed form. Imposter syndrome moved in. I started comparing my beginning to people who had been doing this for years. Who am I to do this? They have more experience. They've been at this longer. What I wasn't acknowledging was everything I had already built. Over 20 years of corporate experience, formal hypnosis training through my certification program, which required hands on sessions as part of the process, and additional sessions I continue doing with coworkers, friends, and family before and after becoming certified. I had been doing the work long before I ever registered the business, but I wasn't giving it any of it value because I was measuring myself against an external timeline instead of recognizing my own experience. That was the messy middle, and it's the part most people misinterpret. Once you decide to change, resistance begins. Not because something is wrong, but because your mind is wired for safety. And safety to the mind means what's familiar, even if that what's familiar is exactly what's been keeping you stuck. Think of it as your autopilot trying to revert back to its original programming. That programming is your belief system, the one that was shaped long before you were conscious enough to choose it. When you start to shift, the autopilot kicks in. It pulls you back to what it knows. That internal tension is what makes this phase so unstable. The question is whether you're aware enough to catch it in the moment. Catch it when the thought shows up like, I'll do it later, I'm not ready, what if this goes wrong? Because in that moment, you have a choice. Your old belief is knocking on the door. You don't have to let it in. This is the part most people miss, that awareness is what changes everything. This isn't a character flaw, it's how the mind works. And I don't just know this clinically, I know it because I lived it. After nearly 30 years of battling depression and trying to understand why certain patterns kept repeating, no matter how much therapy or personal development work I did, one hypnosis program created more awareness than everything I had tried before. That curiosity led me to get certified. What I couldn't keep to myself became thriving pathways. What most people don't talk about is how much courage it takes just to acknowledge that a change is needed in the first place. That acknowledgement can carry real weight, shame, hurt, and sadness. Because for many people, it feels like admitting failure, like something is wrong with them. But it's not failure. Think about sports. A player who loses a game is not a failure. They review what happened, identify what needs to improve, and make adjustments. That's not weakness, that's growth. Acknowledging that something needs to change is exactly the same thing. It's information, not judgment. This is part of why the brain creates resistance so aggressively in this phase. If you carry a core belief that you're not good enough or that you don't belong, your brain will do everything in its power to keep you from taking actions that might expose or confirm that belief. The resistance isn't random, it's protective. The brain would rather keep you stuck than risk proving what you already fear about yourself. And this is exactly why changing the belief at the root is so critical. Because if the belief stays the same, the behavior will keep following it. No matter how much effort you put in, the mind will continue pulling you back to what it believes is true. Recognizing what's happening is not a reason to stop, it's a reason to keep going with more compassion for yourself than you've probably been offering yourself. There is also a grief process happening here. And most people miss it because we've been taught that grief only belongs to loss of a person. But grief is the physical and emotional response to losing anything significant to you. I was grieving several things at once: my dad, my independence. I had lived alone for 7 years before the move. My corporate identity, after more than 2 decades of knowing exactly what my role was and what was expected of me every single day, the structure and security of a steady paycheck, and the betrayal of people I had been close to. Each one was a real loss, even the ones that didn't look like loss from the outside. Think about buying a new car. You're excited. It's an upgrade. But you might still find yourself sitting in the driveway for a moment, reminiscing about the old one. Maybe it was unreliable. Maybe it broke down constantly. Maybe it was objectively a junker. It doesn't matter. Your brain doesn't evaluate familiar things by how well they served you. It evaluates them by how long they've been there. And when they're gone, there's a real loss, even when letting go was the right decision. Same thing happens when you start to change. You're not just building a new version of yourself, you're letting go of an old one. The version that learned how to cope, the version that adapted to survive, the version that felt familiar even when it no longer served you. Letting that go isn't easy, and most people don't name it as grief, so they don't know how to move through it. They just feel the weight of it and assume something is wrong. Nothing is wrong. You're mourning something real, and that's part of the process. This is where I see a clear pattern with clients. Some stay consistent, they listen to their recordings, stay engaged in the process, and continue reinforcing the identity they're stepping into. Others fall back into automatic patterns, not because they consciously decide to stop, because the mind defaults to what it has been conditioned to do. Think about physical fitness. You can't exercise whenever you feel like it and expect results. Research shows that within just 1 week of inactivity, you can lose up to 10% of the muscle and strength you worked to build. That's why every person who has ever gotten fit and stay fit will tell you the same thing. It was hard and they did it anyway. There were days they wanted to stay home, rest, do anything else. They showed up regardless because they understood that consistency is what builds the result, not intention. The same principle applies here. There were days during my own process where I was working through spotty internet signal, staying in while everyone else was out, choosing my work over anything else because I knew what was at stake. My web designer kept me accountable, and I reminded myself this is how I provide for myself and my family. Consistency wasn't glamorous, it was showing up anyway, even on the hard days. I had a client who came to me just 2 weeks before a flight. She had been carrying anxiety for over 20 years and fear of flying for 15. What made the difference wasn't just a session, it was her commitment to the process. She stayed consistent, listened to her recording, and kept reinforcing the work even with the pressure of an upcoming trip. She boarded that flight feeling calm. I've also seen the opposite, clients who start the process but don't follow through consistently, not because they can't change, but because the pattern pulls them back to what's familiar. It's not about how fast change happens, it's about how consistently you show up for the process. Consistency is what turns a new identity into something real. Something I hear often is, I'm too busy. Time is one of the most valuable assets we have. When something truly matters, we find the time. So when the response is, I'm too busy, it's worth pausing because most of the time, it's not about time. I know this one personally. When I moved back to Oregon, I was moving back into my own home where my daughter and my grandchildren were living. I went from living alone in a clean, organized space, prepping simple meals, handling errands in one weekly trip, to a household with a 3 year old and a 6 year old. My daughter finally had support and naturally leaned on me for everything. The chores multiplied, the grocery runs became several trips a week, and underneath all of it was mom guilt. There were times I had not been there when she needed me, and I knew she was burnt out as a single mother with an inconsistent co parent. So when she needed me, saying no felt wrong. I had to set strict boundaries around my work time, not because my family didn't matter, but because my work was the reason I made this move in the first place. There were moments I locked my door to take a session or meet a deadline, and I could hear my grandson crying on the other side, wanting to come in. That doesn't get easier, but I held that boundary because I understood that what I was building mattered. It's rarely about time, it's about what the mind is trying to avoid, because the mind will create reasons to avoid whatever feels unfamiliar. And if you let that pattern lead, it keeps you exactly where you've been trying to leave. Even when something feels completely rational, it's worth pausing. Not everything that makes sense is actually moving you forward. In my case, I told myself I was being responsible by waiting on the insurance call, and that was partially true, but it also became a way to delay action. The fear of losing my liability insurance, the one thing standing between me and the carrier I was so passionate about, kept me in analysis mode for longer than necessary. This is especially common for analytical thinkers. We believe the more analysis leads to more clarity. Most of the time, it leads to overstimulation, running scenarios, imagining worst case outcomes, and staying in a loop that feels like progress but isn't. The mind isn't trying to move you forward, it's trying to keep you safe, and overthinking is one of the ways it does that. Overthinking feels like progress, Most of the time, it's just resistance with better reasoning. The antidote isn't more thinking, it's consistent action. Life doesn't pause while you're doing this work. You can be navigating stress, uncertainty, and emotional triggers while also trying to shift internally. That's a lot to carry. Many people wait for the right time, but that moment rarely comes because life is always moving. I didn't wait for the right time either. I started applying this work while I was still in my corporate role. I began setting boundaries in an environment where there was always more work to do. In the CEO's office, you could sit there for hours and never reach the end of the list. But I started prioritizing my own mental health. I began disengaging on weekends and actually living fully. I communicated to my team to text if something needed my immediate attention, and I would sometimes glance at my email but would not respond until Monday. That was new for me, and it was a choice I had to make consciously every single time. On my walk to the office just 2 blocks away, I did my daily affirmations and listened to audio recordings. When I felt triggered or emotions started surfacing, I would pause, reframe, and analyze what was coming up. Anytime the inner critic tried to make an entrance, it got shut down. Not because I had eliminated doubt, but because I had built enough awareness to catch it before it took over. That is what consistency actually does. It is not about perfection or having the right conditions. It is about showing up for the new version of you before it feels natural, before it feels like yours. From a clinical standpoint, what you're doing with that consistency is planting and growing a new belief system, a new identity, and new habits. Think of it like planting a seed. Once you plant a new belief, daily consistency is the water that helps it grow, become rooted, and create the identity and habits around it. Without that water, the new belief never has the chance to develop, grow roots, and become who you are. And when it doesn't grow, it dies. That empty space doesn't stay empty for long. The old belief system will always try to come back and fill it. What matters most during this phase isn't perfection, it's consistency. Something I remind myself on a regularly. This feels unfamiliar, but I'm making it familiar. The goal isn't to reinforce who you were, it's to reinforce who you're becoming. When resistance shows up, it's easy to get frustrated with yourself. That frustration is often what causes people to stop altogether. This is where grace and compassion matter. Your mind is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It is protecting you by keeping you in what feels familiar. That doesn't mean you stop, it means you recognize what's happening and continue anyway. Awareness without compassion leads to discouragement. Awareness with consistency leads to change. Nothing has gone wrong. This isn't the part where you stop. This is the part where change is actually happening. The resistance, the internal pull, the uncertainty, none of it is a sign to go back. It's a sign that something is shifting. You're not doing it wrong, you're in the middle of it. Stay consistent, acknowledge what's coming up, keep reinforcing the version you are becoming, because that's what turns something unfamiliar into something that becomes who you are. The shift doesn't happen when life gets easier. It doesn't happen when the resistance disappears or when you finally feel ready. It happens when you recognize what's been running in the background all along and you choose to keep going anyway. For me, that moment came when I realized it wasn't the lawsuit, it wasn't the insurance, it wasn't the timing, it was my own deeply rooted belief trying to protect me from failure. Once I caught it, I had to reframe it. There's nothing shameful about having fear. Fear is actually a signal. It means you're stepping into something that matters to you, something new, something worth doing. The goal was never to get rid of the fear. It was to stop letting the fear to take over, to feel it, name it, and move forward anyway. That's the breakthrough. Not a single dramatic moment, but the moment you stop letting what's familiar have more power than where you're going. Take a moment and sit with these two questions. What part of me is creating the resistance or procrastination? What has staying in that familiar place actually cost you? If you recognize yourself in this and you've been stuck in the same pattern, procrastination, or self doubt longer than you want to admit, the real question is how much longer are you willing to stay there? Time will pass either way. You can keep repeating the same cycles or you can start changing what's driving them. This is the work I do using hypnotherapy, helping you identify and shift the beliefs and patterns at the root so you can move forward with clarity and consistency. If you're ready to stop going in circles and start making real changes, schedule a complimentary call here at www.thethrivingpathways.com/appointment. If something in this episode brought awareness to a pattern you hadn't fully seen before, take a moment to reflect on it. Awareness is where meaningful change begins. The more we understand the subconscious beliefs shaping our reactions, the more power we have to respond differently and create new outcomes. Thank you for spending this time with me and for being part of these conversations about awareness, growth, and transformation. If this episode helped you see something more clearly, share it with someone who may benefit from hearing it. And make sure you subscribe so you don't miss next week's Breakthrough Weekly. I'm Monica Pelayo, and I'll see you next time.